Well, good morning. Any visitors this morning? Where? From where? Ohio? Whereabouts? Shelby County. Both of you? Okay, Mercer County and Shelby County. Cincinnati Diocese, right? Shelby? Yeah, okay. I know my geography. Anybody else? Well, welcome to all you this morning. As we gather here this morning, we look at this reading from Matthew, and there are three people in this, or three groups of people in this story that we need to look at in order to understand what was going on. First of all, there's Jesus, who is kind of the new guy in town, and he's become a very popular preacher. And then there's Matthew, who was a Jew, but he was a tax collector. And that was a very important thing, because he wasn't collecting Hebrew taxes, he was collecting Roman taxes. What the Romans typically did when they conquered a country was that they would get local people, and they would collect the taxes imposed by Rome, and they had the ability then to also charge more than what the Romans did, and that's how they made their money. Now, especially in Palestine, the tax collectors were not just seen as tax collectors, but they were seen as collaborators with the enemy. See, the Romans were the occupying force. And so any Jew who was willing to take up the task of tax collector often got ostracized from their own community. Now, there's nothing to say that Matthew was dishonest, anything to say that he was not an observant Jew. It was just that he was a tax collector, and therefore, because he was a tax collector, wasn't looked upon very kindly by some people. The third group of people were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a group of highly observant Hebrews, and their task, it seemed, was to protect God. They were all busy protecting God. You ever meet people like that? You know? And the difficulty with that stance often is that God gets recreated in their image and likeness instead of the other way around. And so they begin to impose on others what their particular vision of God is. That happens in our day still amongst some Catholics. There are people who impose how they see God, and they think everyone should do that and do it the way they think it should be done. Well, the Pharisees were that way. So these three things came together. Jesus calls Matthew, and Matthew invites him to lunch. And of course, who do you invite to lunch? Your friends. Well, who are Matthew's friends? Other tax collectors, right? So the Pharisees are outside grumbling. Why is that man in there eating with sinners? Their word. And all of a sudden, Jesus knows what they're saying, and so he confronts them. Now, what's the message for you and me this morning? The message is pretty simple. The message is about prejudice. Now, we connect prejudice with racial differences. But prejudice, if you look at its word, at the root of its word, means to prejudge. So no matter what you do or who you are, I already have an opinion, and I'm not changing. You see? But we're all filled with prejudice. And the prejudices we have sometimes slip by us in our examination of consciences because they're not the kind of prejudices that, if you will excuse the word, popular. For instance, there are many people who are prejudiced against old people. Did you ever notice that? You're driving with somebody and someone's going slow and they say, this is probably an old person. And often it's me. I take umbrage at that. There are many people who are prejudiced against young people. What do they know? There are people who are prejudiced against people in their own families, who refuse to allow the other person out of the box that they've prepared for them. They can't change because they won't let them change. And so prejudice has many faces. You know, I think I've told you the story about preaching in this small town, and the town was about as big as this room. And people would say things like, well, what do you expect? They're from the upper part of town, which was like from there to there. No matter how small the group, there can be prejudices. No matter how small the group, we prejudge people. And so the message for us today is, what prejudices do we have in our lives? If we're young people, do we have prejudice against older people? Do we refuse to hear the wisdom that older people can bring? If we're older people, do we refuse to listen to the younger people? Now, the problem with all this is simple, that everyone in our lives, everyone who's around us, carries within them a treasure. And if we are filled with prejudice, we will never come to experience their treasure. We will never come to experience fully how God works through their lives, because in their lives we don't want to enter. We don't want to share what gifts they have because we've already prejudged them. We've already set aside them. We've already marginalized them. We've already said they have nothing to offer. So it's very important for us to examine our consciences. It's very important for us to look at ourselves and to challenge ourselves, to make sure that we minimize prejudice, because we'll always have some amount of prejudice. There will always be that in us, but our task is to minimize it. How many times have we heard from our own mouths, well, what do you expect? Look where she went to school. What do you expect? Look where she grew up. What do you expect? Look who his father was. We're filled with prejudices that hold the gifts of other people locked up so that they never can experience, that we can never experience fully the gift they are to us from God. And that's what was happening in the story today. The Pharisees could not see how God's grace could possibly work in the life of Matthew and his friends, because they were collaborators, and they had already made a choice that these people were sinful. As you and I pray today, let us look at our own lives, and let us see who it is that we're holding bound, and realize through our prejudices we impoverish ourselves. For there are, in fact, treasures hidden in the people we do not like. And as long as we do not like them, their treasures will always be hidden from us. As you and I pray today, let us examine our consciences and let us go deeply and to challenge ourselves. Who don't we like, and why don't we like them? And how can we overcome that prejudice so that we can discover in them God's love for us? Prejudice, it keeps us from God's gifts. Let us look at it in our own lives, and let us stretch ourselves and try to discover what God has in store for us. Be at peace and learn to love one another with God's love.